Hi, my name is Lydia Jones, and I'm going to be presenting on the bubonic plague. So common names for the bubonic plague include the pestilence, the Great Plague, or the Black Plague. The causative agent of the plague is the bacterium Yersinia pestis. And bubonic plague is actually one of 3 types of plague. It is the most common type of plague, and it is characterized by swollen, painful lymph nodes, and it can also easily progress into the other 2 types of plague, which are septicemic plague and pneumonic plague. Septicemic plague occurs when the pathogen gets into the blood system and spreads to the organs, which can result in organ failure, and pneumonic plague occurs when the pathogen gets into the lungs. Pneumonic plague is the most fatal type of plague. It almost always results in death unless treated. So to just kind of give you a historical perspective on the plague, there have been 3 major epidemics throughout history that are the most significant in terms of their mortality. So the first major pandemic is the plague of Justinian, which occurred from about 541 to 542 AD, and it was a pandemic of the bubonic plague that occurred in the Byzantine Empire. It's believed that it spread from Africa up to the Mediterranean, specifically the port city of Constantinople, most likely on trade ships. And scientists believe that the original strain might actually have been from Asia. So a study from 2017 found a strain of Yersinia pestis in the mountains between Kyrgyzstan and China, and what they found was that it was a really ancient strain of Yersinia pestis that they believe, after doing a phylogenetic analysis, is very closely related to all existing strains of the plague today. So, the second major pandemic was probably one of the most infamous outbreaks of disease in all of human history. It is what we now know as the Black Death, and it occurred from about 1347 to 1353 AD, and it resulted in the death of about 1/3 of the population of Europe. So it had a really significant effect on society because of the really high mortality rate, and this is probably one of the reasons that it is so well remembered today. And scientists believe that that too may have spread from China via the Silk Road, so it could have been endemic to that area between Kyrgyzstan and China and was spread from there. So the second pandemic didn't actually end with what we know as the Black Death. The plague remained in Europe through the 17th and 18th centuries. So there was the Italian plague, during which 1/2 of the population of Venice alone was killed, the Great Plague of Spain, which resulted in more than 1 million deaths in the country, the Russian plague, the Great Plague of London, and many other countries were also affected by outbreaks of the plague. So the third and final major plague pandemic began in the Yunnan province of China in 1885. And it resulted in more than 12 million people being killed in India and China, and then it also affected many other Asian countries. It affected Russia as well, Australia, and it even crossed the Pacific to San Francisco in the United States. And this pandemic was actually considered active through the 1960s, with many cases being seen in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. So it's also believed that plague was possibly one of the first agents of biological warfare. So during the Black Death, or the period known as the Black Death, during what was called the Siege of Kaffa, which was a city in what is now as modern-day Ukraine, the Tartars who were attacking the city hurled cadavers of the deceased, those who had died of the plague, with catapults over the city walls in an attempt to infect the inhabitants. And then during World War II, the Japanese army used plague-infected fleas as a form of biological warfare against Chinese and Manchurian troops. And there's definitely been the concern following 9/11 of the potential for the plague pathogen to be used for bioterrorism. So a new question that has arisen is, was the plague a reason for the Neolithic decline? So the Neolithic decline was a significant and rapid collapse in population that occurred about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago in what is modern-day Europe. And a 2018 study discovered that Yersinia pestis was in 4,900-year-old human remains from Sweden. So at this archaeological site, they discovered 79 corpses that had been buried in a really short amount of time, and they discovered that Yersinia pestis was present in most of these human remains. And the specific strain that they found actually predated all previously known strains, so it raises a lot of questions about the exact origin of the plague and what role it could have had in Europe prior to the plague of Justinian. So how is the plague transmitted? Well, the plague is transmitted between humans and animals, and it is seen in many rodents and other small mammals. And the way that it is transmitted from animals to humans is primarily via the Xenopsilla chiopsis, or the oriental rat flea. So while rats kind of got the bad rap during the Black Death for being the ones who spread the disease, it was actually the fleas. So the fleas will bite a rat who's carrying plague bacteria, and then the bacteria will multiply inside the flea, which is acting as the host, and then the flea will bite the human. And when fleas bite humans, they squirt saliva or partially digested blood into the bite, containing the bacteria, and this is what leads to infection and eventually disease in humans. So transmission can occur between humans, but it's fairly rare. It's more common for humans to contract the disease from a flea bite. But when transmission between people does occur, it usually requires direct contact, or it requires contact with body fluids of an infected person. So droplet precautions should be taken, especially in the case of pneumonic plague, because once it spreads to the lungs, those who are infected will usually start coughing up blood. So the CDC recommends keeping a distance of at least 6 feet from a plague victim who has pneumonic plague and has been coughing up blood. So, some more background on the causative agent of the plague. Yersinia pestis is a non-motile, gram-negative bacterium, and it belongs to the family Enterobacteriaceae, which is the same family as E. coli. And it is remarkably homogeneous. It has only one serotype, only one phage type, and 3 biovars. And it also has the remarkable ability to get past mammalian defense mechanisms and to multiply really rapidly once inside a human host. So like I said, Yersinia pestis does require a host to multiply, but it can live for several weeks in wet soil, in grain, sputum, corpses, and flea feces before it finds a host. So when a flea initially bites a human, there is an inflammatory response at the site of the bite, and then the bacteria will spread from the bite to the lymph system and the lymph nodes, which is what results in those really swollen lymph nodes that are characteristic of bubonic plague. So, Yersinia pestis actually contains a plasmid which codes for 3 proteins, YOP-H, YOP-E, and YOP-N, and these proteins are coded for at 37 degrees Celsius, which is optimal human body temperature, so they're only activated once the pathogen gets into the body, and they really help the pathogen to fight back against the human immune defense. So, YOP-H specifically is anti-phagocytic, YOP-E is cytotoxic, and YOP-M binds thrombin, which is an enzyme that aids clotting in humans. So, like I said, Yersinia pestis does tend to escape phagocytosis, so macrophages will actively try to phagocytize bacilli, but then are themselves killed by bacillary toxin. There's still a lot of research to be done on the adaptive immune response to plague. So we do know that there is antibody-mediated protection, and we also know that T cells play a big role in the defense against Yersinia pestis. They generate protective cytokines that assist phagocytes, that allow them to phagocytose Yersinia pestis. And we do know that there are plague-specific T cells in patients that do survive, but there's still a lot of questions on exactly all the mechanisms of the immune response to plague. So, as for signs and symptoms, it has an incubation period of about 4 to 6 days, and initial symptoms include severe malaise, headaches, shaking, chills, and fever. And then as the disease progresses, you will see swollen lymph nodes and what are called buboles, which are significantly swollen lymph nodes that have pus and edema, and they can very easily become necrotic. And spread of infection from those swollen lymph nodes can lead to septicemia, organ failure, spread to lungs, and then death. So, current incidences and prevalence of the plague. The plague is present in the United States. Most of the cases that we see are in the southwestern, rural United States, and we have on average about 7 cases a year. As far as other countries, it's seen most commonly in Africa, specifically in Madagascar. They usually have a yearly outbreak of the plague, and it is also seen in South African and Asian countries. So, for recent outbreaks and events, in May of 2019, a Mongolian couple died of plague after eating raw marmot kidney, and then in November of 2019, there was an outbreak of bubonic plague, which is still currently ongoing in northern China. So the first case was of a 55-year-old man who caught and ate a wild rabbit in Mongolia. And as of November 28th, there have been 4 confirmed cases. And what's really concerning about the outbreak is that 2 of those cases, which are currently in Beijing, were confirmed to be pneumonic plague, which is the most dangerous, the most easily transmissible, and usually the most fatal type of plague. So, how can you prevent from getting the plague? Well, one of the key things is to reduce rodent habitat in your homes, so you want to minimize the chance that you'll come into contact with rodents, with fleas, or with flea feces. And definitely wear gloves if coming into contact with rodents or other mammals that might be potential carriers of the plague. So this picture is a prime example of what not to do. As well as wearing flea repellent if you're in an area that you know has the plague, and also using flea control sprays on your pets. And definitely do not eat the undercooked meat of wild game. So, treatment for the plague. Plague can be successfully treated with antibiotics, and antibiotic treatment should begin as soon as possible. So, optimally, you want to start antibiotics within 24 hours of the first symptoms presenting. The chances of survival really increase whenever the antibiotics are administered as soon as possible. And patients should be hospitalized and medically isolated if there's a suspicion that they might have the plague. And right away, as soon as they're admitted to the hospital, it is common procedure to test blood as well as fluid from the swollen lymph nodes. So there is no current vaccine for the plague. Several groups are currently developing vaccines, and there's plans for clinical trials in 2019 and 2020, so hopefully there will be a plague vaccine that will be released to the public in the near future. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.